The next section we're going to get to here is, well, what do you all need to know about English learner students? And first is that we're going to define who is an English learner. So the National Center for Education Statistics reports the number of English learners, or ELs as we call them, in public schools rose from 4.7% to, from 4.7 million to 11.2 million students between 1980 and 2009, or a 21% increase. English learners are an extremely diverse set of students, and in the United States today they represent over 425 different languages. But of all those English learners, 80% of them are Spanish speakers.
And I just wanted to just say, in your definition, I noticed that we sometimes tend to use English learners, English language learners. So I don't know if there's a preference. I know that in certain states, English language learner is the terminology, and then in other places it's English learner. So,
well, and there's other places yet that I think they're called bilingual language learners, or LEP student is what the feds still use in addressing this group. So there are many labels for the same group. The majority of English learners, as we will define and label them in this presentation, are born in the United States and actually have received all of their education in an American school. Yet they achieve oral fluency in everyday language fairly quickly, but have difficulties achieving that academic language that we'll define in a bit here, that they need in order to be academically successful. But the term English learner does not include students who are truly bilingual and fluent in two languages, and those are a far more rare student. The next question to pose here is, given that the number of English language learners in our public schools, we need to ask, are all students prepared to teach English learners? Well, in 2002, the National Center for Education Statistics found that among 41% of teachers in the United States that had EL students in their classrooms, only 12.5% had received 8 or more hours, only 8 or more hours of professional development and instruction of ELs. So we can say that the majority of teachers have had little to no instruction in meeting the specific needs of English learners.
And I have read several studies in which they have done survey of educators, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges, that they say that they have not received instruction, they don't feel comfortable working with English learners, and so I think you're pointing out that that's a big need, should be heard across campuses across the United States.
Right. Well, the next thing that we want to get to here is to look at English learners and 3 categories of students who experience academic difficulties. So there are, first of all, English learners who experience these difficulties only because of ineffective instructional programs and environments. And that's something we discussed a moment ago, that instruction that is not appropriately adjusted to their specific language needs may be often the core problem in their struggles. The second reason may be difficulties due to life experiences. Many of our students have immigrated here from various countries and have come for a variety of reasons, some to escape war, some have come through refugee camps, some have witnessed incredible acts of violence. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration to ask the question, how prepared is the student to learn in terms of kind of their socio-emotional aspect. And English learners that truly have intrinsic disorders are the third group of students that struggle. And that's what we're trying to get to really be able to make a good decision to targeting those students that truly have disorders and providing the right support for them, and usually in a special education program. So next we're going to talk about language and the specific language needs of English learners. So on the screen, what you'll see here is a picture of an iceberg. And we often use this in the ESL bilingual field in terms of talking about two structures of language. And those structures are here above the waterline of this iceberg, something we call BICS. BICS means Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. And that is everyday language, or known as social language, playground language, and kids can become fairly fluent speakers of English, of this everyday language, within 1 to 3 years of learning English. However, in order to be academically successful in school, they really need to develop what is here shown below the waterline of the iceberg, and that's that deep structure of language that we term cognitive academic language proficiency. So Jim Cummins, a researcher of Canada, coined these terms about 40 years ago to differentiate the language demands that children have on them and what kind of understanding and use of language that they need to be successful. What you'll also see on this iceberg is next to the right hand of the BICS and KELP arrow, 5 stages: pre-production, early production, speech emergence, intermediate fluency, and advanced fluency. Those 5 stages represent the continuum of language development from no language to full fluency in language. But as you'll see, 4 of those stages are above the waterline, meaning it's going to take a long time for a student to develop that KELP language, that academic language. What that means to teachers is we need to do a lot of rigorous instruction of language and instruction about language and make our instruction comprehensible all along so that students don't miss critical core concepts because they're having difficulty comprehending the language. So once again, to define what BICS is, it's language proficiency needed to function in everyday context and to carry on conversations, versus KELP. That's that level of language needed to function in decontextualized academic settings where they're required to understand linguistically and conceptually demanding texts and content areas and to use this language in an accurate and coherent way in their own writing and in their own responding. This typically takes between 5 to 7 years to develop. But it could be up to 11 depending on the model of instruction that they've had. For example, if a student only has ESL instruction through a 30-minute-a-day pull-out program, it may take them up to 11 years because they don't have enough instruction in language, vocabulary, language structures, forms, and function for them to fully develop that deep structure and to access curriculum. So this is a problem.
And Julie, I think what's interesting when you talk about BICS and KELP is that you define 3 levels of students. So while these are generalizations in terms of how long it will take children to develop the KELP portion of the language, the other piece is looking to see in which category your English learner falls into. So for example, if you have a child that has a language disorder, that variable might have a very different outcome in terms of their developing language as opposed to maybe the second one that is here in the United States as a result of immigration, refugee, and have other kinds of challenges that are very different than the challenges you will see in the third group of students. So I know that you're giving generalizations, but as you were talking about that, I was thinking to myself, the other piece is in what category do they fall, and then what's that variable in terms of their acquiring the language and how long it's going to take them.
Right. So children with true disabilities do acquire the language at different rates and sometimes don't actually acquire the full fluency. So we'll continue thinking about that and talking about that as we move along. So I have a few terms I want to define next because they sometimes are confusing to people. The first is language proficiency. First or second language proficiency. So when we talk about what is proficiency, it merely is a person's competence in processing through listening and reading and using through speaking and writing language. So it's just their use of language. And language proficiency alone will not be a determinant of a child's ability to learn in the second language. For example, we used to say that we couldn't start to teach an English learner reading until they reached a certain foundational level of English. But that's actually not true. We can teach the foundations of English, phonemic awareness and phonics, particularly phonemic awareness, before they have much of a base in English. So we need to rethink this concept that proficiency alone is not an indicator of when we need to begin instruction.
Good point.
The next term is primary language. And how do we determine a student's primary language? Primary language is best determined through a home language survey that is in every child's registration packet upon entering any public school in the United States. So a parent will identify the languages in the home. And it's the language that the student learns first and uses most frequently in the early stages of their language development. And the important concept to know about this is that parents must be encouraged to use the primary language at home with their students and to demand that their students answer them, to continue that dialogue, because they may be the only environment in which children can continue to develop that primary language. And it's critical that they develop that language base. Another reason for discussing primary language is that I find often that school teams misunderstand primary language in students that have significant disabilities. So for example, if a student is a nonverbal student, I hear teams say, well, the student doesn't have a language, so we might as well provide instruction in English. However, they negate that home language, that receptive base that that child has built over their lifetime before entering school cannot be negated. So their primary language, although it may be receptive, is still the language of their home, and often we go back to mother tongue for that. What is the language of their mother? And that's a critically important concept to remember, that all children do in fact have a primary language.
And I think that an excellent point when you are trying to define that whole notion of what does language proficiency mean, because I think there's some confusion with all of the terminology. Sometimes I think it's the way that we ask the questions that determine the kind of information that we're going to access about what language is used in the home. So I think it's really important that we understand some of those definitions.
Well, there's one more that I'd like to speak about before we move on, and that's dominant language. Because as an assessment personnel, I frequently read articles to talk about how we assess English learners and bilingual students. And often a recommendation is we'll assess in the dominant language. And I think that that could be confusing, because dominance is a confusing concept, basically. Dominant language really means that it's the language that the student chooses to speak in a given situation. For example, a student in an English-only school environment, by default, their dominant language is going to be English, because they don't have a choice. However, if they go home, in their community, in their church, their dominant language may switch to their primary or their first language or their home language. So therefore, I think that it's very situational as to what dominant language is. So we'll discuss that a little more when we discuss assessment issues.
And I'm glad that you just brought that up just for a moment, because the whole issue of dominance, when I, as a speech pathologist and also as an assessment professional, is a definition that we sort of grapple with in the whole assessment process. So I know you're going to come back to that, and we can talk a little bit more about that.
The slides next on the screen, I will show 5 slides that define that language continuum a little more, and we're actually not going to read through them all, but I'm just going to target some particular information I would like our audience to know about. So the stages that I showed you on the iceberg Those can be conceptualized as stages 1 through 5 because states and even districts within a state might have different labels for those, but generally we conceive of the language continuum in 5 stages. So here the first and second stages is where the child may begin with no English and then get to the point where they have words and short phrases that they can say. And sometimes at the very beginning, students go through what we call a silent period where they're listening to the sounds of the new language because probably there's some sounds in English that are not native to their first language. So they need to spend time listening, much as a baby does in their first year of life. What I want people to know that at this stage, when children are doing a lot of listening and we're giving a lot of comprehensible input, meaning we're showing and telling, that students can always be active in the instruction by doing any of these activities here. So instead of expecting beginning English learners to be a passive student, we really want them right away to be an active student, and we can then frame our instruction around asking them to point or draw or match or circle information in order to show us what they are learning. And that's very important to know.
I think what's interesting is when you talk about that particular period and you say it's a silent period.
At the very beginning.
At the very beginning, that most people will think a silent period is a passive period.
Right.
So I think you make a very good point in
Yes.
saying they can do certain things. And just by the notion of the words that are chosen, you can point, you can
Right.
circle. It doesn't demand production, but they actually are very actively participating.
Yes.
So
You know, and I think one other thing that we should address during the silent period is it could be misinterpreted as a disorder.
absolutely.
Okay. The third level then, which is still BICS, that basic level, is where students have good oral skills in English but minimal reading and composition skills. So I want to change that minimal to basic reading in composition and reading skills in English. Here, students can recall, retell, define, describe, compare, and contrast. So they can do quite a bit of work, but they still need a lot of support in that language. And this is the time where we really need to focus on building vocabulary and helping them to understand language structures. And many students kind of get stuck at this level 3. We find that it takes them longer to move past the stage. And I think this stage, then it's really critical for instructors to focus on how we explicitly teach the language that students need alongside of explicitly teaching the core content. So as we move up to the higher tiers, levels 4 and 5, early advanced and advanced fluency, this is where students are beginning to sound and look like an English-only student. However, I want to make the point clear that an English learner, even after they're identified as a fluent speaker of English, where they may be exited from their ESL program, they are never going to be the same as an English-only student. So they will always lag behind in language and need some extra attention paid to language in order to be as successful as they can be in a classroom. So here at this level, you'll see that they're nearly proficient in English, but they may still have trouble with standardized tests. So therefore, those test scores may underrepresent what their true knowledge is and their true skills because of the language and sometimes the cultural demands on tests. Okay, moving on. This kind of summarizes the 5 stages, and to know that from a teaching point of view, all levels of English learners benefit from this. Modeling and explicit instruction, frequent opportunities to practice using language, visual aids and graphic organizers, cooperative grouping activities, hands-on and manipulative activities, and vocabulary strategies. Another way to look at the language profiles of English learners is through this graphic. So what this is showing is the goal is we would really like to have bilingual students to be proficient in 2 languages. However, because of the factors that are in the white box, those socio-political factors, all of those reasons impact a student's ability to fully acquire their first language, which is the top arrow, L1. And what we find is that we have English learners who, before they get to develop fully their first language, English, a second language, is introduced. And that generally, because it is the dominant language of our country, kind of takes over for that first language. Therefore, they reach about midpoint in their first language development, and it's difficult to then develop their second language much further than their first language foundation. So we can see profiles of US-born English learners where they're midway on the first language continuum and midway on the second language continuum. And if we were to give them standardized assessments, such as speech and language assessments or cognitive assessments, we could find by standardized scores that they look as a child with a disability would look. However, the reason for their struggles are really these factors and not an intrinsic disability. So we have to be very careful in looking at children's language abilities and the reasons for what may look like low languages in two. And one other piece is people used to confuse code mixing when children used their strengths in two languages as a disorder, and we know that it's not a disorder, but really that is the child using their total reservoir of languages, and we need to consider really the totality of a child's language rather than looking at it language by language.
And that's such an important point in terms of this kind of unequal, for lack of a better word, development of language, and how, in terms of assessment, really being able to discern, what's going on and making sure that we are not diagnosing or misdiagnosing children as language disordered, when in essence there are other reasons that we need to look at. The other point is working cooperatively to look at the different pieces, because your lens as a bilingual psychologist might be a little different than the lens that I take as a speech-language pathologist. And how we define language. And at least when I am working with English learners, I look at normal language development. I have to know second language development. And then I have to really understand what are some of the commonalities that you would see in children acquiring a second language. What are some of the things that I would see or characteristic of children learning a second language? And then looking to see, okay, what are really characteristics that you would see in children that have disabilities? So really understand, and I have to say, after doing it so many years, there are still times that I'm stumped.
Right. Well, I think what you brought up was a critical point, that this is a collaborative activity, that our team really needs to have members with many different lenses. So it's important that the speech and language pathologist, special ed teacher, general ed teacher, and ESL specialist be involved in any decision. And there's another member of the team who's particularly important, and that is parents.
Absolutely.
And we can really help to distinguish difference from disorder from the very beginning by having a good parent interview, because sometimes those developmental red flags are evident just in your beginning conversations with parents, and that will help lead you to discerning difference from disorder.
Which brings me back to when you're talking about language proficiency and the use of the home language survey. And while that is a requirement usually in many of the school districts, I don't
in all of them.
think
It's a federal requirement.
I don't think it is the only thing that should be used, and I think that's really important.
Right. So I want to include a quote here about what we've just discussed, and that is, young children who've not had sufficient opportunities to develop cognitive skills in their first language before learning a second language are at greater risk for academic delays than their peers who've had opportunities to develop and use their first language. And I think that's what we were seeing with that those two arrows on that slide.